Have you ever wondered why web hosting support always seems to be so terrible? You know what I mean if you've ever contacted web hosting support before. You can't find their support information, there's no contact information on their website. You might find an AI chatbot that's clearly blocking any form of access to get through to support. Assuming you do find a way to contact support, it's going to take forever to get through to them, either by phone or in waiting for a reply from an email that you've sent. Once you do get in touch with them, there's always some sort of problem. The representative that you're talking with doesn't seem to know anything about hosting. They seem like they're, in some cases, new hires. They're following scripts, copying and pasting replies, quickly dismissing the problems that you're calling to report about, or otherwise saying in some way that they can't help. If they then let you know that there is someone that can help, you have no access to that person. Whoever can fix it is a delegation or an escalation away, and you're going to have to wait for that person to both find the time to get to your problem and then take a look at it, all with the hope that they're not just going to turn around and do the same thing. Send another script, send another gut reaction reply, not take a look into the issue, send a question that was clearly already answered either in the conversation that you had or the email that you sent. It seems like every support call in many cases leads to either some sort of chaos or some sort of upsell. They're often trying to push you to an upgrade path to get more money out of you in the process of not fixing the problem. If you've wondered why that is, there are some common causes. One of the more obvious ones is that the host isn't actually selling what you're buying. In many cases, what the host is actually selling is some corner of their sandbox. Basically, they understand that you like to play in the sandbox, that you want to have a website hosted up on the internet, and so they've put together some sort of bare minimum sandbox that allows you to plug your website into the internet and hope for the best. They haven't really done anything to provide amenities or add any type of extra to that hosting that you may have come to expect. So something as simple as regular backups or baseline security may not be something that they're even accounting for, because ultimately what they're doing is just plugging you into the internet and giving you a corner of the sandbox to play in as you wish. If it's something that simple, then really you're just talking about a difference of focus, but it could also be something else systemic with the host. In many cases, hosting is seen as a commodity, and so the host tries to charge as little as possible in order to justify whatever it is that they're selling. But the problem with that is that whatever they're charging is going to determine what they can buy, just like it determines what you can buy. In other words, you get what you pay for, and they also get what they pay for. So if you're paying them not enough because they're not charging enough, they can't afford to buy top tier talent, they can't afford to put excellent energies into training their talent, they can't afford the tools that they need to do whatever it is that they need to do, either to maintain the hosting or to ensure that your support request is fixed as quickly as possible. That means they can't buy proper technology for the actual servers in many cases because they have to buy what they can afford instead of what they ought to afford. And then frequently they're also going to have to oversell their services. If they're overselling their services, I'm sure you know what that's like. If you've ever been on an airplane that's overcrowded, you've been on any type of public transportation or public event that's overcrowded, it's not a pleasant experience for anybody. And this is no different when you're talking about web hosting than it would be with any of those situations. Too many people in too small a space is always going to be an uncomfortable situation at the least. The way that plays out with hosting usually is something like instability, random problems that you can't explain. And then obviously when you contact support, they can't explain them either. Those are common symptoms of running into a host that's oversold, but it's not just the way that they charge or the way that they're overselling services that can cause this type of issue. It could also be that the host is just in a profit-seeking mode. Now, ultimately, every company, if they're providing good service, that the point, if they exist as a company at all, is to make a profit. But just because the goal is to make a profit, it doesn't mean that they're in profit-seeking mode. If they're in profit-seeking mode, is that the only thing that they care about is whatever the bottom line is. And so frequently, if you run into a host that's in profit-seeking mode, the bean counters are running everything. That means that they're trying to cut costs as low as they possibly can. They're not investing into more expensive, say, service people, because those more expensive service people on paper appear to be costing them more. They're also often prioritizing different metrics for support. So, common metrics that a host is going to support if they're in profit-seeking mode is something like the total number of tickets that are closed or the average response time to closing a ticket. On the surface, that sounds great, but ultimately it's not the ticket matters, it's whether or not that ticket then solved a problem. So the metrics are different when you're talking with a host that is interested in solving actual problems, because what they're interested in doing is recording the number of problems solved, not the number of tickets closed. Those are very different metrics. A lot of times, this is not always the case, but a lot of times you can also spot a host that's in profit-seeking mode because of who owns the host. It is not uncommon for hosting to be owned by investment groups. Now, there's nothing wrong with investment groups, but the whole point of an investment group is to try to extract a profit out of that investment. So it's also quite common, at least in the hosting world, for those investment groups to start prioritizing those bean counter modes. And it is a fairly common story that you find a host that was once great that then is bought up by an investment group, and then all the problems that you really don't like about the quality of their support start to arise at around that time. So ultimately, if that's what causes that type of bad support, what is it that you can do to solve it? To solve it, you're kind of stuck, because ultimately all of those problems are systemic. That means the only one that can fix it is the host, and you can't fix the host. So either you're going to have to fix the host, which you can't do, or you're going to have to fix the problem by changing the host, looking for somebody else who's already prioritizing the same things that you're prioritizing. So what does that look like? Generally speaking, a host that's interested in prioritizing the types of problems that you actually have with your website is going to be terming themselves a little bit differently. One term is managed hosting. Managed hosting is the idea that somebody is going to have to take care of the hosting, and if that's not going to be you, it should be the host, because the host knows what they're doing. A managed host in many cases is selling at a more premium tier, because what they're doing is including a whole layer of service along with the hosting that they're selling. And because of that, they have to charge accordingly to be able to afford that extra attention. That comes in a few different packages, but there's another type of host, a little more rare. It's something that we like to call delegated hosts. And a delegated host is a host that is intending for you to delegate your problems to them, because the problem that you're calling about and the problem that they're attempting to solve are usually going to be different problems. When you buy hosting, what you're looking to do is put a website up on the internet and then essentially not have problems. And those problems can be all over the map. And what you want to do is try to find somebody who can own as many of those problems as possible, so that you have guidance whenever it's something that you need to fix. You have solutions whenever it isn't something that is your problem to fix, like if it's the host issue. In those gray areas, you may get a little bit of a mixture of both, but ideally you have as few problems as possible, and those problems get rectified as quickly as possible. That's something that has to be built into the host. It's fairly rare to find that, because it requires them to take ownership of things that really they have no control over. So how do you spot those kinds of hosts, managed or delegated hosts? Well, certainly in the terminology, they're going to refer to themselves as a managed host or as a delegated host. But another proxy for that is price. As we said earlier, you get what you pay for. And if you get what you pay for, what that means is that if you're paying too little, you're going to get too little. But if you're talking about shared hosting, if that shared hosting is routinely advertised on the host's website at under $10 a month, there's a fairly good chance that they are not interested in taking on what a managed host or a delegated host would do to solve your problems. So you're looking for something probably that's over $10 a month at the cheapest price point for shared hosting. I've found in practice, as I've taken a look around the industry, that it's often closer to about a $15 a month price point. That is generally where this starts to turn. That's going to allow them, if they're charging accordingly for every customer that comes in, to buy the kind of infrastructure that they need to give you a good hosting experience, to minimize the type of problems that you're going to experience, to close those problems down quickly, to afford the top tier talent that they're going to need to be able to take on all of those support issues and solve them in a way that you'll find satisfactory. It's going to allow them to avoid overselling servers, because they're making enough off of each server that they can afford those things for you without having to try to upsell you on every call, just to be able to get you to a point where the service is baseline acceptable. And then ideally, they're also going to be able to invest in their own company. And by that, what I'm talking about is things like R&D. R&D is a good proxy for the better types of hosts out there, because many hosts don't do R&D. They're either outsourcing that to some sort of like a control panel company and expecting that control panel company that serves the entire industry to do all of the necessary unnecessary R&D to make your life easier, or they're doing a minimal amount of R&D internally, mostly for things like managing their own problems. If they're doing R&D and talking about R&D on a regular basis throughout their website or throughout their marketing materials, that's a different kind of host. That kind of host is investing heavily in solving problems. That's the only point for doing R&D. And sure, it may be some problems that allow them to serve you better through the quality of their support or to do their support job better. But the better hosts out there, if they're really investing in R&D, are also releasing tools that you can leverage. That could be all sorts of things. A lot of times it's going to be in the security space, giving you tools that you're able to use for yourself. It could be in the performance environment, speed or stability. You'll find technology that you can use or tap into, either baked into their hosting that they're talking about extensively, or with optional features that they're giving you to be able to control that further. You can kind of tell whether or not this is R&D on the part of the host or just something else that they sourced from some other vendor that's doing the job for them based on the terminology that they're using. If you see the same terminology used in a whole bunch of different hosts, it's probably something that they've gotten off the shelf from elsewhere in the industry. But if they're branding all of this stuff themselves, they're doing that R&D. That type of R&D is often an indicator that they have the time to invest in R&D, which means that they have the time to do good support. So look for cues about whether or not they're doing R&D. If they're heavily talking about that, that's a good sign for the type of host that you're looking for. Other focuses are going to be things like emphasis on security and performance. Why is that? Well, security and performance, they're easy to talk about, and many hosts do talk about those. They're going to talk about things like how they have fast servers and how they have a firewall. That's great, but those are just generic terms. Anybody can buy something and call it a fast server. In most cases, most hosts will have something they say is a firewall, but there are different kinds of firewalls. The best way to spot whether or not there's somebody who is taking this seriously or not is if they're providing something called a web application firewall, and if they're going the extra mile to try to help you out of security binds in the event that you do wind up having some sort of security issue. So if your site suddenly has malware on it and you have to deal with that, there's a different kind of host who's going to try to help you out of that problem after it happened than one that says it's just your problem. Basically, if they're putting themselves on the hook to help you out in the event that something goes wrong, that's a sign they take this very seriously and they're trying to solve problems for you instead of problems for themselves. So take a look for cues like that as well. Obviously, you can take a look at reviews. If their support is great, the reviews are going to reflect that. So check out review sites. There's a bunch of review sites out there that aggregate reviews for hosts. Trustpilot's a fairly popular one, but if you just go to Google and search for, whatever the name of the company is and reviews, you'll typically find a reviews page somewhere where you can get a good sense of how the quality of the support is and take those seriously because they're going to reflect something from a customer's perspective. Ultimately, give this one a little bit of care and thought, but the ownership of the company can also matter. As I mentioned earlier, some hosts are owned by investment groups. If you know the host is owned by an investment group, that doesn't mean that they're inherently going to start prioritizing that bean counter mode, which is trying to cut costs down to the bare minimum for the sake of making a profit. But it is far more common for that when you are talking about a host that's well known to be owned by an investment group versus a host that's owned by a private company or individual of some sort. Those are all different ways that you can try to suss out what looks like a good host. The crux of it is, at the end of the day, is that you're looking for a host that's going to own as many problems as possible, specifically the kind of problems that you're trying to solve, not necessarily just the problems that quarantine off and say this tiny little slice of problems that only has to do with the hosting. That's what will help you with, and anything else is on you to figure out. Because at the end of the day, if those problems keep popping up and you're not getting solutions and the host seems to be playing a part in every one of those problems, then it's going to be difficult, at least difficult, to question whether or not they're the ones who are contributing to the cause of those problems, if nothing else. At the very least, they're certainly not helping to close them out, and that's not doing anybody any good. So take care when selecting your hosting, because the quality of the hosting is going to determine everything about the quality of life that you're going to live with the host that you picked, what your website's going to perform like, and what your experience is going to be like when you contact support to solve a problem that you probably think shouldn't have happened in the first place.